Hello friends, I'm glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you a story about an HOA that claims to own a house. My grandfather Victor was a man of quiet dignity. He didn't speak much about his struggles, but I knew how much this house meant to him. It wasn't the biggest or the most beautiful, but it was his. A sanctuary he built brick by brick through years of hard work. When he passed, I inherited it, just as his will explicitly stated. I was still processing his loss when the first sign of trouble appeared. A letter from the HOA, stamped with a bright red, urgent. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was a routine notice about community regulations. But as I read the words on the page, my stomach sank. The letter claimed that my grandfather had signed an agreement years ago, stipulating that upon his death, the house would revert to the HOA. It was theirs now, they said, and I needed to vacate immediately. I read the letter twice, then a third time, hoping it would make more sense. How could this be possible? I was the only one named in his will. There was no mention of such a contract in any of the documents he left behind. The letter ended with a deadline, 30 days to surrender the property, or they would pursue legal action. My first reaction was disbelief. This had to be some sort of mistake. But when I called the number listed, I was met with the smug voice of Martin, the HOA president. "Oh, it's no mistake," he said confidently. "Your grandfather signed it. It's legally binding. You can either hand over the keys now, or we can do this the hard way." That conversation ignited something in me. I wasn't going to let them bully me out of my grandfather's house. This was more than property. It was his legacy, and now, mine. I didn't know much about legal matters, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't backing down. The moment I hung up the phone with Martin, I felt a mix of anger and determination. How dare they claim what wasn't theirs? I knew I couldn't handle this alone, so I decided to get to the bottom of it. The first step was revisiting my grandfather's will. I spread out all the papers on the dining table he used to sit at, searching for any mention of the HOA. Nothing. The will was clear. I was the sole heir. There wasn't a single clause about transferring the house to anyone else. Still, doubt lingered in the back of my mind. Could there be a document I hadn't seen? Something my grandfather signed without realizing its implications? I needed someone with legal expertise, so I scheduled a consultation with Grace, a probate attorney I found online. Grace was calm but firm when I explained the situation. "If your grandfather signed something legally binding, the HOA might have a case," she said. "But contracts like this are rare, and they'd need rock-solid proof." Her confidence gave me some relief. She advised me to contact the HOA and demand a copy of the document they were relying on. I called Martin again, my voice steady this time. "If you have this so-called contract, I want to see it," I said. A few days later, I received an email with an attachment. The document was a poorly scanned contract dated 10 years ago, supposedly signed by my grandfather. It stated that upon his death, the house would become HOA property. At first glance, it looked legitimate. The signature did resemble my grandfather's, but the more I examined it, the more questions I had. Why was the document dated during a period when my grandfather was in the hospital recovering from surgery? And why wasn't it notarized or witnessed? Grace's reaction confirmed my suspicions. "This doesn't add up," she said. "A contract like this without proper notarization is weak, and the timing seems suspicious." But that wasn't all. As I started digging into the HOA's practices, I learned that I wasn't the only person they had targeted. A neighbor, Sylvia, told me over coffee that the HOA had pressured her elderly father to sell his property at a fraction of its value. Another neighbor, Aaron, mentioned mysterious fees and threats to put liens on homes. I realized this wasn't just about me. The HOA was running a racket, exploiting vulnerable homeowners. Fueled by this discovery, I knew I couldn't let them get away with it. Grace agreed to take on my case, and we filed a formal lawsuit against the HOA, demanding they prove their claim. But Martin wasn't done trying to intimidate me. A week after the lawsuit was filed, I found a letter in my mailbox with a single line: "You're making a mistake." I wasn't afraid, I was furious. This wasn't just a fight for my home anymore. It was a fight for everyone they'd wronged. Filing the lawsuit felt like a victory in itself, but I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Grace made it clear that the burden of proof was on the HOA. They have to show that this document is valid and enforceable. Our job is to prove it's not, she said confidently. To build our case, Grace suggested hiring a forensic document examiner, Oliver. He had a reputation for being meticulous and thorough, and his findings would be critical. I agreed immediately. When I met Oliver, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. He spread out the scanned contract alongside samples of my grandfather's handwriting that I'd provided. "At first glance, this looks convincing," he said. "But handwriting can be tricky. Let me take a closer look." Over the next few days, Oliver analyzed the document, using tools I couldn't even pronounce. When he finally called me back, his tone was sharp and precise. "This signature is a forgery," he said. "The pen pressure and angles don't match Victor's natural writing style. It's been copied, badly." That was the breakthrough I needed. With Oliver's expert opinion, we had proof that the document wasn't legitimate. But Grace wasn't satisfied with just debunking the contract. She wanted to dig deeper into the HOA's operations. We started gathering testimonies from neighbors who had dealt with the HOA's bullying tactics. Sylvia agreed to share her story about how they had pressured her father into selling his home. Aaron provided documents showing unjustified fines the HOA had slapped on him until he threatened legal action. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. The HOA, under Martin's leadership, had been targeting vulnerable homeowners for years. Grace speculated that their endgame was profit, acquiring properties at little to no cost and flipping them for a tidy sum. Meanwhile, Martin doubled down on his arrogance. His lawyer filed a countersuit, claiming my lawsuit was frivolous and defamatory. He paraded around the neighborhood, making comments to anyone who would listen about how I was wasting everyone's time and how he would put me in my place. Grace wasn't fazed. "If anything, their aggression shows they're desperate," she said. "But we need more than that. We need something that ties Martin directly to this scheme." That's when fate intervened. A neighbor named Linda, who used to serve on the HOA board, reached out to me. She was hesitant at first, but after I assured her anonymity and legal protection, she shared an explosive piece of evidence, an email exchange between Martin and another board member. In the emails, Martin explicitly outlined a plan to forge signatures on contracts for deceased homeowners and use legal threats to acquire their properties. It was clear and damning. Grace's face lit up when I forwarded the emails to her. "This changes everything," she said. With the forensic analysis, neighbor testimonials, and Linda's leaked emails, we had a rock-solid case. Grace filed a motion to include the emails as evidence, and the court granted it. The pressure was mounting for Martin, but he didn't let it show. He hired an expensive legal team and even went on local news to spin the narrative. "This is just a misunderstanding," he said with a smug grin. "We're following the rules to the letter." But his confidence didn't intimidate me anymore. I had the truth on my side. As the court date approached, Grace spent hours preparing me for my testimony. "Stay calm, stick to the facts, and don't let their lawyer rattle you," she advised. I couldn't help but think about my grandfather during those long nights of preparation. He would have been proud of how far I was willing to go to protect his legacy. By the time we stepped into the courtroom, I was ready. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial began. Martin sat at the defense table with his legal team, looking as smug as ever. I sat with Grace, who had meticulously prepared for this day. My confidence was solid, but the stakes were high. This wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about exposing the HOA's corruption. The judge called the court to order, and the HOA's attorney opened with an argument dripping with condescension. "This is a straightforward case," he said. Victor willingly signed a legally binding document transferring his property to the HOA upon his death. The plaintiff, while understandably emotional, is ignoring the law. Grace's rebuttal was concise. "This case is far from straightforward. The HOA's claim is based on a document riddled with inconsistencies, and we intend to show that it is a forgery, part of a larger pattern of misconduct." The HOA's first move was to present their supposed contract. The defense attorney held it up dramatically, as though it were the smoking gun. He explained how Victor allegedly agreed to the terms voluntarily. They even called Martin to the stand, where he smugly described the HOA as a benevolent organization that only wanted to protect the community. Under cross-examination, Grace didn't hold back. "Mr. Martin, can you explain why this contract lacks notarization or witnesses, as required for property transfer agreements?" Martin squirmed but stuck to his story. "Victor didn't think it was necessary. He trusted us." Grace nodded, feigning interest. "And yet, despite that trust, this contract conveniently benefits the HOA in a way that no other member of the community has agreed to. Isn't that odd?" Martin stammered, but before he could answer, Grace moved on. Next, the defense called an HOA board member to corroborate Martin's claims. She stumbled through her testimony, contradicting herself several times. It was clear their story was unraveling. Then it was our turn. First, Oliver took the stand. The courtroom grew quiet as he described his forensic process, pointing out the glaring differences between the signature on the contract and Victor's actual handwriting. "In my expert opinion," he concluded, "this signature was copied and is not authentic." The defense attorney tried to discredit him, but Oliver's credentials and calm demeanor held firm. Then came the neighbors. Sylvia testified about the HOA's pressure tactics, recounting how they bullied her father into selling his home. Aaron shared his experience with fabricated fees and threats of foreclosure. Finally, Grace called Linda, the former board member who had leaked the emails. As she took the stand, Martin's confidence visibly faltered. Linda described in detail the conversations she had witnessed as a board member, painting a picture of an HOA more concerned with profit than community well-being. Then, Grace handed her a printed copy of the leaked emails. "Can you confirm that you received this email from Martin?" Linda nodded. "Yes, and others like it. Martin explicitly instructed us to target homeowners who were elderly or deceased. He said it was an opportunity to acquire properties cheaply." The defense scrambled to object, but the judge allowed the evidence. Grace read excerpts aloud, and the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The emails were damning, proof that the HOA's actions were premeditated fraud. When Martin was called back to the stand, he tried to spin the emails as misunderstood and taken out of context. Grace's questions were sharp and relentless, exposing every inconsistency in his story. By the time he stepped down, his earlier bravado had all but disappeared. As the trial drew to a close, Grace delivered a powerful closing argument. She reminded the court that this wasn't just about a forged document. It was about an abuse of power that affected an entire community. Eli's grandfather, Victor, trusted his family to preserve his legacy. The HOA violated that trust, not just with him, but with countless others. Today, we have the chance to hold them accountable. The defense attorney tried to paint me as overzealous and emotional in his closing argument, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, my heart pounded. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The HOA's claim is invalid, and the document in question is declared a forgery. Furthermore, the court orders the HOA to pay damages for emotional distress and defamation. I sat there in stunned silence, relief washing over me. The judge wasn't done. Additionally, the evidence presented today will be forwarded to the appropriate authorities for further investigation into the HOA's practices. Martin's face turned pale as the implications sank in. The courtroom emptied slowly after the verdict, but I remained seated for a moment, letting it all sink in. I had won, not just for myself, but for my grandfather and everyone else who had been wronged by Martin and his HOA cronies. But this wasn't the end. For Martin and the HOA, the real consequences were just beginning. A week later, the fallout started in earnest. Grace filed additional lawsuits on my behalf, seeking further damages for the emotional distress and defamation caused by Martin's smear campaign. The compensation I had already been awarded was substantial, but Grace made it clear that Martin and the HOA had deep pockets, and we intended to make them pay. The leaked emails became a key piece of evidence in the lawsuits that followed. Linda's bravery in exposing the HOA's corruption sparked a flood of new complaints from other residents. People who had been too afraid to speak out now came forward with their own stories of extortion, forged documents, and financial manipulation. Law enforcement launched a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. It didn't take long for them to uncover financial irregularities. The HOA's books were a mess, riddled with evidence of embezzlement and fraudulent transactions. Martin was the prime suspect, and his once smug demeanor quickly vanished. Within a month, Martin was formally charged with fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. His assets were frozen, his reputation destroyed, and his legal team abandoned him when it became clear they couldn't defend his actions. The same neighbors who had once feared him now openly celebrated his downfall. The HOA board dissolved under pressure from the community. Without Martin's leadership, the remaining members scattered, eager to distance themselves from the scandal. The disbanding of the HOA felt like a victory not just for me, but for every homeowner who had been subjected to their bullying. For my part, I used the settlement money wisely. First, I repaired and restored my grandfather's house, ensuring it was the warm, welcoming home he had always intended it to be. The rest of the money went towards setting up a legal fund to help other victims of HOA abuse. The fund quickly gained traction, attracting donations and support from people across the country. It became a resource for homeowners who found themselves facing the same kind of predatory tactics that Martin and his HOA had employed. Meanwhile, Martin's life spiraled downward. Bankrupt and disgraced, he faced a lengthy prison sentence. Seeing him stripped of his arrogance and power was the ultimate vindication. The community, once fractured by fear and manipulation, began to rebuild itself, free from the oppressive grip of the HOA. For me, the journey had been exhausting but worthwhile. I hadn't just saved my grandfather's house. I had protected his legacy and stood up to those who sought to exploit the vulnerable. On the first anniversary of the verdict, I invited Linda, Sylvia, Aaron, and other neighbors to the house for a small celebration. As we gathered in the backyard, I looked around at the smiling faces and felt a deep sense of pride. "This house isn't just mine," I told them. "It's a symbol of what we can accomplish when we stand up for what's right." The battle had been long and hard, but in the end, justice prevailed. And while Martin's downfall was satisfying, the real victory was reclaiming the sense of community that the HOA had tried to destroy. As the sun set that evening, I knew my grandfather would have been proud. His house was still standing, a testament to resilience, courage, and the power of doing what's right, even when the odds are against you. Friends, thank you. See you soon.